Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to talk to you about the power of plants in ancient Egypt. Now, Egypt is a land of contrast. You can see on the map the green area in the center. This is the cultivated strip, and it's created not by rainfall, but by the annual flooding of the River Nile. This happened throughout antiquity and has only recently changed in recent years with the building of the dams on the river, allowing water through as and when necessary. But in antiquity, the Egyptians knew that they had this narrow strip of cultivation for growing their crops, rearing their animals, and living, and they could not sacrifice this for the burial of the dead. So from earliest times, they took the dead out and buried them on the edges of the desert. And in the left-hand image, you can see this clear line of demarcation between the cultivation and the desert. And the desert being hot and dry preserved both the bodies and the objects, the artifacts that were placed in the tombs. So Egypt is rich in antiquities, largely because of these environmental factors. Now, we're going to look generally at the significance of plants in ancient Egypt, and I'm just going to speak very briefly on these headings: religion, architecture, mummification, food, personal adornment, cosmetics, and then the bulk of the talk will be about the use of plants in medicine and pharmacy. So first of all, plants in religion. The Egyptians believed strongly that plants were magical and powerful and could bring about healing and well-being for the living. They were also symbols of rebirth or regeneration, and so were important after death. In the left-hand image, you can see the god Osiris, the god of the underworld, the afterlife, and you can see the plants surrounding him, in particular the lotus flowers, which are placed upon the offering jars. In the right-hand image, we can see the offerings being brought by the different sections, geographical sections of Egypt, to the gods in the temples, and again, a wealth of individual plant material. Now, the Egyptian temple was believed to be the island of creation. It was believed, according to mythology, that there had been water, darkness across the face of the universe, and then an island arose out of the water. On the top of this, some demigods emerged from the edges of the water, and they placed a building which was made of reeds and things that they could find lying around on the island. And this became the first shrine and the first temple. And all Egyptian shrines thereafter have these same features. So you can see here, this is the forecourt of the temple of Horus at Edfu. The capitals represent the plants growing up from that island of creation, and the capitals represent the plant forms that were found on this island. Now, these are magical, they're potent, they bring life to the temple and thus to Egypt, to the gods, and to the whole of Egyptian humanity. Here we can see them in more detail. On the left-hand side at the Temple of Kamombo, you can see the capitals of the plants. They're different types of plant forms. And on the right-hand side, in the Temple of Edfu, again, notice the capitals, different plants. And then at the base of the columns, you have the representation in stone of the earth mound from which the original plant forms were thought to emerge. And then in the center, just a detail here of the mixed or hybrid plant forms that we find on some of the capitals. Now, plants were also used in mummification. They were used as part of the packing material that was placed inside the abdominal and thoracic cavities once the viscera were removed in the process of mummification. They were also used more generally in anointing the mummy, and this was to stop, or at least to cover up, the smell of mummification that was part of the process. And then we also get them on the outside of the mummy. In the left-hand example of a child mummy, you can see in the hand it's holding a wreath of red flowers. This is part of the cartonnage mask. And then in the other scene, we can see the plants again drawn, painted on the coffin. So there were various ways in which the plants added their particular power to the mummy and its ability with the individual person to be revived and resurrected in the next life. So mummification is a key feature in ancient Egyptian civilization, both in Egypt and in museum collections worldwide. There are large numbers of preserved ancient Egyptian mummies. And this was the result, of course, of this geographical feature I mentioned at the beginning. We have this limited cultivatable and habitable land, and so the dead are buried in the desert in shallow graves. And here on the left, you can see the contrast of the desert and the cultivation at the top, and at the bottom, this is looking down from the tombs at Beni Hassan to the cultivation beyond. So these hot, dry burial conditions ensured that the bodies were dehydrated and that they were preserved. And this resulted in natural or unintentional mummies, as we call them. Later, for various religious and other reasons, the upper classes performed a method known as intentional mummification. And this involved the use of an agent called natron, which is a kind of salt that is found in natural deposits in Egypt. And this effectively dried out the body. So you retain two types of mummies in ancient Egypt, the intentional mummies and the unintentional or natural mummies existing throughout the history side by side. Now, plants were also a source of food, and we can see this very clearly in the funerary arrangements. On the right-hand side, in the tomb of Senegem, in the royal workers' village at Deir el-Medina, you can see Senegem and his wife tilling the ground and harvesting crops. The idea was that the afterlife was a mirror image of this world, but without its problems. So they would live in eternity in an idyllic version of the ancient Egyptian situation. And so growing food for eternity, to have an eternal food supply, was very important. And it was believed that all these images would be brought into life, into existence for the dead owner by means of magic. On the left-hand side, we have a scene from a temple. And again, it shows the food that was available for presentation to the god. So these, of course, reflect the kind of foods that were available to ancient Egyptians in life, and it was mainly a vegetarian diet, very little meat, some fish, but basically vegetarian. Now, plants were also used for personal adornment, this magical idea that they would give life to the individual. On the left-hand side, there is a famous pectoral or chest ornament known as the Ricky pectoral in the Manchester Museum collection. And this was placed on the chest of the mummy, and all the elements in the pectoral, the decorative elements, have magical significance. So would bring the afterlife to the person who owned it, who wore it. And here we can see again the lotus flowers on either side. On the right-hand side, we have a coffin which belonged to a mummy in the Leeds Museum collection. And the mummy was unwrapped and autopsied back in 1825. And the researchers found inside the mummy there was a collar, a floral collar of plants. And then these same plants are represented on the coffin, painted onto the coffin, which we can see here. So there was a double provision, if you like, both the floral collar inside and then painted onto the coffin outside. Plants were also found in cosmetics. There was a very large cosmetic industry. These items here all come from a town called Cahoon, which was where the royal workmen and their families lived when the workmen were engaged in building one of the pyramids in the Fayum in Egypt. Now here on the right-hand side, you can see a box of makeup, which was found in one of the houses at the site. And in the box, there is a coal stick. This was for outlining the eyes with black coal, and juniper berries, which were crushed and used in makeup. On the left-hand side at the top, we have ointment jars, makeup jars, with the remains of the materials inside. And at the bottom, there are perfume jars. Plants were used in perfumes, and they were used to anoint and embalm your body in life. Then we come to the use of plants in medicine and pharmacy. And in these medical papyri, which I'm going to talk about more in a minute, we have the prescriptions for medical treatments. On the left-hand side, there is a gynecological papyrus, again from the town site of Cahoon. And on the right, there is the so-called Ebers papyrus, and this has a whole variety of different prescriptions. So the key ingredients in the inscriptions were plants, minerals, and animal products. Now we're going to talk about certain scientific studies that have been undertaken on plants in terms of pharmacy. And to do this, we carried out a whole range of investigations at the K&H Centre for Biomedical Egyptology at the University of Manchester. The main focus of the centre, well, it has an interdisciplinary approach. We combine historical with scientific methodology, and we look at disease, medical treatments, ancient lifestyle, mummification, and religious techniques in ancient Egypt. It's the only university facility anywhere where Egyptology can actually be studied as a degree in terms of bioscience. And we base our teaching and research on the diagnostic tools that have been developed, such as radiology, histology, immunology, and increasingly the molecular techniques. And here you can just see some of activities in the center. At the top left-hand corner, CT scanning the Leeds Mummy to gain information in a totally non-destructive way. In the bottom left, you can see work on the immunocytochemistry to investigate a disease called schistosomiasis. And in the right hand, we have the use of the industrial endoscope to take samples from deep inside the mummy for a whole range of investigative techniques. So Egyptian pharmacy, well, just basically to say that the principles were that you included either disagreeable substances or pleasant substances. The disagreeable ones, which could include excrement and urine, these were designed, it was thought, to expel evil from the patient. But on the other hand, you could use pleasant things such as aromatic oils to attract the good gods to help the patient. So it was a two-edged process. The methods, well, they included mineral drugs such as gold, silver, or precious stones. And you can see in the bottom left-hand corner a gold tongue, actually from a mummy. And this they use gold quite a lot, again, in the treatments. At the top, we have some of the plants. These were vegetable and plant products found in the environment. And then we also have fragments of animal products as well. So the pharmacy in ancient Egypt project that we had some years ago at Manchester, this was innovative and it was multidisciplinary. And it combined these historical and scientific approaches that we developed for looking at disease in mummies. We extended this to the ancient Egyptian pharmacy project. And it was supported, the project, for 3 years by a research grant from the Leverhulme Trust. So these were the main aims, to use these historical and scientific techniques to look at ancient Egyptian pharmacy. And then second, to either confirm or to revise the existing translations that had been made of these prescriptions in the medical papyri. But then we also wanted to look at the plant remains themselves and actually to identify which plants had been used in ancient pharmacy. And then to use immunological and ancient DNA techniques to look for any traces of pharmaceutical treatments that might remain in the mummified tissue. And finally, we wanted to see how accurate and indeed how therapeutic these ancient treatments were. So we had a whole range of resources for this work. For example, we had access to collections of both modern and ancient plants in Britain, in museum collections and in a botanical centre, and also in Egypt. And we had a range of unprecedented scientific facilities. For example, in Manchester, we developed the ancient Egyptian mummy tissue bank, which has over 2,000 samples of mummified tissue from collections around the world, which is used for both our own research and other projects as well. And then we also had this very interesting cooperation with the Medicinal Plant Conservation Project at St. Catherine's Protectorate in Sinai in Egypt. And here you can see some of this, these facilities where they were growing and developing medicinal plants and seeing how they reacted in different microenvironments. So this project was established in 2002, and it was a plant conservation project focusing on medically important plants. And they involved, it was an Egyptian government initiative, they involved the local Bedouin because they used medicinal plant remedies and still do. And so their knowledge was vital to identify which of the plants locally were medicinally useful. And then we wanted to see whether there were similarities or differences between these modern traditional medicines and the therapies that come from ancient Egypt. So it was a very interesting ethnographical and Egyptological combination. We went out to Sinai. Here you can see some of our staff with the late Professor Demirdash pointing out some of the features. He was head of the medicinal project in Sinai. And it was important because it's interesting to see this continuous pharmaceutical tradition from ancient through to modern times. So just first of all, a word about this very important resource, the medical papyri. Now, 12 major medical papyri are known from ancient Egypt. And when you think Egyptian civilization lasted some 5,000 years, this is just the tip of the iceberg. The rest have obviously either been destroyed, never been discovered, or they may be in libraries of papyri, but have yet to be identified. Most of the ones we have date from around 1550 BC, but they are copies, very evidently, of much earlier texts. Now, even within this 12, this small group, they appear to have several different functions. Some of them are handbooks that doctors would consult in a daily capacity when they were treating their patients. Some of them seem to be the outlines of medical lectures that the teachers at the medical schools would have used. And then yet others are records of the instruction that the students took down. It's important to note that none of them have any unity of the subject or composition. They are, if you like, a sort of ragbag of different things. And they all contain, whether they are from the early ones or right down to the Greco-Roman period, they all contain what are known as rational and irrational treatments. Now, rational treatments are those where the cause of the problem is evident and a logical, rational treatment is prescribed. The irrational treatments are those for diseases or conditions where the cause is not evident, and they attribute it in many cases to evil spirits or unfortunate events. And then magical treatments are recommended. So those two sit side by side throughout the whole of Egyptian history. But what these papyri do show is how Egyptian medicine was very complex. And not only did it have remedies which were purely Egyptian, but it also had a small number of foreign remedies from other parts of the ancient Near East, such as Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean, for example, Crete. So previous studies on pharmacy in ancient Egypt, there had been previously translations of the medical papyri, which contained these therapies that were used by the ancient Egyptians. Completely separately and never tied up with the documentation, there have been botanical studies, both of ancient and modern Egyptian plants. But what our project did was to combine the two. So we studied the literature, the literary accounts, but also we looked at the plant remains from Egypt and then tried to trace any pharmaceutical treatments in the mummified remains. So it was this combination of history and biomedical science that came together for the first time. So first of all, we have to consider how accurate are the existing translations of the pharmaceutical ingredients. Now, they were translated from Egyptian hieratic and hieroglyphs into various European languages in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. And it's generally agreed amongst Egyptologists that some 30% of the translations of the ingredients in the medical papyri are disputed. What had to happen when they translated the documents is to rely heavily on the context to almost guess at the meaning of a word. Then you can compare that with other documents, other translations, and see whether that meaning actually works well in other contexts as well. The problem with the medical papyri is that many of the words for the plant ingredients do not occur anywhere else in any other documentation. So you can't compare them with other situations. And this makes the translation of these documents really problematic. So what happened was that the early translators made educated guesses, and then they consulted the contemporary pharmacopoeia to find an ingredient with the same medical use that would be best fitted to the description. And this, of course, raised all sorts of difficulties in getting accurate translations. What we've managed to do with our project was to establish which plants were actually grown and used in ancient Egypt or were available in modern and Egyptian African contexts. So you're looking at plants that would have been grown and available in ancient times in Egypt, or could have been imported from nearby countries. So we had a pilot scheme in Manchester which compared 4 of these medical papyri. That's the Cahoon, the Edwin Smith, the Ebers, and the Chester Peaty. And these were compared with 20th century pharmacy. And from these 4 documents, the results from this contradicted academic claims, which in some cases said that ancient Egyptian pharmacy was almost entirely and certainly mainly magical. So the way this worked was that the named ingredient was checked to see if it would have worked in the way the prescription indicated. Now, a forensic chemist today would analyze a sample, but of course we don't have the samples readily available from ancient Egypt. So these were made from the recipes, modern versions, in the papyri, and then they were tested. And the papyri actually preserve all the information that you need to reproduce the remedy. There are the ingredients, the method of preparation, and the dosage. And the pilot scheme came up this very interesting result, that Martingale's Extra Pharmacopoeia from 1977, which was when drugs were still prepared in dispensary, this contained 64% of the same ingredients named in the Egyptian papyri. And in terms of preparation of the remedies, 67% of ancient Egyptian remedies complied with the British Pharmaceutical Codex of 1973. And this, of course, these are the standards and protocols for major medicines. So the pilot scheme was deemed to be extremely successful and interesting, and it formed the basis for what we went on to do next, which was to analyze 1,000 prescriptions from the ancient medical papyri, dating from about 1850 BC down to 1200 BCE, and then to compare this with contemporary standards and protocols. So again, we checked if the plant named in the prescription drew or was traded in Egypt when the papyrus was written. And we have a lot of evidence about Egypt's flora from the geological and archaeological sources. And this eventually resulted in a plausible identification of some 284 medicinal ingredients from 134 plant species, 24 animal elements, and 28 minerals. Excuse me. So the effectiveness of these remedies, well, we can say that they were ignorant of the causes. They didn't always certainly know what had happened, but they focused on the symptoms. They knew the drug, the dose, and the administrative method, and the condition for which it was prescribed. And this is information that we have today. And we can compare the effectiveness of the ancient remedies with the modern ones. 64% of Egyptian prescriptions had a therapeutic value on a par with drugs used in the last 50 years. And in the image here, this is a schistosome, causative parasite of the disease schistosomiasis, which is 2,000 years old, and we'll come back to that later. So these are some of the effective treatments from the ancient documents, and you can see them here. Treatments for excuse me. You can see them here, treatments for laxatives, musculoskeletal disorders, and then parasitic infestations. Interesting here, the extract of pomegranate, which is in the ancient remedies and contains a powerful antihelminthic, was used until 50 years ago to expel tapeworms. And then balanites oil was used to treat urinary schistosomiasis. It kills the causative parasite, and we think this was what was used in antiquity. You do still get these non-scientific treatments, of course, such as the use of hedgehog quills for baldness stuck into the head. This was thought to help the growth of the hair, and the use of fish, in which a migraine, the patient was tapped lightly on the head with a dead fish, and the migraine was thought to transmit, to move into the fish. But again, at the bottom here, celery for pain relief was used, and this occurs as a modern anti-rheumatic treatment, and saffron again has a modern application. So some of the techniques that were used, analytical techniques, you can see here light microscopy, environmental scanning microscopy, and the Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. And we analysed resins and unguents from ancient Egyptian sources. Some of these had also been used medicinally. And it was possible to identify the geographical sources of the pharmaceutical samples, both inside and outside Egypt, and to show that there were trade routes into Egypt for some of these medicinal ingredients from, as we've said, the Near East, also North Africa, modern Libya, Nubia, which is down to the south of Egypt, modern Sudan, and the southern Mediterranean. So the key results of this were able to confirm that therapeutically viable, reproducible treatments predominated over these magical placebo methods. And that's really important because it shows that these methods in the medical papyri were largely pragmatic. 64% of the Egyptian prescriptions had a therapeutic a value on a par with the drugs used in modern pharmacy over the past 50 years. We identified some of the trade routes for the pharmaceutical ingredients. We showed that some of the earlier translations of the medical papyri were incorrect because some of the ingredients, the translation of the ingredients, we found that these elements, these plants, were not present in ancient Egypt, nor would they have been imported from the near regions, and so they must be incorrect. We were able to show that Egypt had a viable pharmacy nearly 2,000 years before it is attributed to the ancient Greeks. And it's also possible to trace through all this that the Egyptian treatments coming down through the Greek and the Roman and then the medieval sources, are actually the basis of quite a lot of Western pharmacy. So the thing to take away from the pharmacy project is that there is increasing evidence that rational, reproducible treatment predominated over magic. It was a proper pharmaceutical system. So we're just going to look now at a few case studies, and I'll just describe briefly how we find the evidence for these medical conditions, and then to suggest maybe a couple of the plant remedies that would have been used. So we're going to look at osteoarthritis rheumatism with the case of the mummies of the two brothers. We're going to look at parasitic infestations in the Leeds Mummy and a mummy called Azru. And then we're going to look briefly at the disease schistosomiasis as the basis for our schistosomiasis project. So case one, the two brothers, these were mummies. The whole tomb was found, in fact, with the burial of two brothers. They were buried at slightly different times, and there's 20 years different age gap between them. Here you can see their body coffins. Now, these are very interesting because the whole tomb group came to Manchester to the University Museum in the early 20th century. And Dr. Margaret Murray, you can see her here in the image in the pinafore, she was the keeper of Egyptology at the museum. And she brought together a multidisciplinary team of medical and scientific experts, and they unwrapped and autopsied these two brothers in Manchester in the early 20th century. And the results from this were the basis of ongoing pathological investigation. And this was a key moment, if you like, this event of the unwrapping in the history of paleopathology or mummy studies. So in 1908, when this early study was performed, of course, radiology and histology were not available, so they had to rely on morbid anatomy. And the diseases they identified were osteoarthritis, kyphoscoliosis, and clubfoot. And the final clubfoot identification has since been overturned, but the other diagnoses have stood the test of time. Here, for example, you can see the skeletal remains of one of the mummies, and you can see the evidence here of kyphoscoliosis, the double curvature of the spine. You can't lay this mummy flat. This is the way when it's articulated, it sits, because in life he would have been bent over almost double as a result of the spinal the spinal problems. So the lifestyle of these individuals, they were the sons of a provincial governor. So they were elite. They were amongst the upper classes of the society. One brother was actually a priest in the local temple, and this burial group in its entirety came from a place called Derifa in Middle Egypt, and they lived and died around 2000 BCE. Now, possible pharmaceutical treatments here for their muscular skeletal conditions may have been mustard, juniper, pine resin, and as anti-rheumatics, they may have used celery or saffron. The second case focuses on a parasitic infection, and we're talking here about the Leeds Mummy. He was again a priest in the temple of Karnak, you can see in the image here, and he was in charge of the sacred cattle who were reared in the temple precincts for offerings to the gods at their daily meal in the rituals of the daily offerings. So the Leeds Mummy, as he's known, you can see the body coffin here on the left, The man's name was Natsef Amun, and in the 1990s, we undertook a complete re-examination of this mummy. The first one was done in 1825, and we updated this with CT scanning and various other techniques of investigation. One of the features of this was the reconstruction, you can see here, facial reconstruction of how Natsef Amun appeared in life. Now, tissue samples were taken from the scrotal area of the mummy and found to contain the remains of filarial worms. The carrier for this infestation is a mosquito, and it gives rise to this disease called filariasis. Now, the worms can block the lymphatic channels, and in this case, they can cause a condition known as elephantiasis, which is swelling or thickening of the skin. It's impossible to see this in mummified remains because, of course, mummification dries out and contracts the skin tissue, so you don't get the evidence of the swelling or the thickening. But if you look at the feet here of Natsef Amun, you can see that the skin tissue is very loose. And so this may be an indicator that he did indeed have elephantiasis. So he was elite again, a member of the priesthood. And as we've said, he oversaw the supervision of the sacred cattle, as well as taking part in the regular rituals at the temple. The exact burial place for this man is unknown, but it was on the west bank opposite the Temple of Karnak, the other side of the river, probably from a place called Deir el-Bahri. And he lived about 1000 BC. Now, here possible pharmaceutical treatments would have included, again, a treatment for his condition, pomegranate, which was very effective against parasites. And then they also would have used laxatives, castor oil, colocynth, figs, and fruit. Another parasitic infestation was found in another mummy from the same area. This is the body coffin of Azru, and she was a singer or chantress at the sacred rituals in this same temple of Amun at Karnak, which you can see on the left. She was in the Manchester Museum collection from the 1800s, and she had been unwrapped prior to that. Her internal organs, her viscera, were in a package upon her knees, upon her legs. So we had access to these, and we were able to take tissue samples, and then using electron microscopy to identify the larval forms of a nematoid worm called Strongyloides in the lining and of the intestine and muscular wall. And you can see these in the lower image here. They're the half moon elements in this view. So the parasite here invades the body through the feet. The worm lays its eggs in the human host, and then eventually they're passed out in the feces, and the whole cycle begins again. So Azru, in this case, is another very interesting example of the parasitic infestations. So her lifestyle, she would again have been a member of the elite, probably a wife of a priest. She would have been a member of these groups of singers and musicians who accompanied the temple rituals. And again, we don't know the exact provenance of her burial, but it's likely to be the West Bank at Thebes, opposite the modern town of Luxor. And she lived around 900 BCE. Again, the possible treatments are the same as previously, the pomegranate as the treatment for the parasite, and then a variety of laxatives. Now, the fourth set of studies are derived from our project on schistosomiasis. Schistosomiasis today is a very debilitating disease. It affects around 200 to 300 million people in 79 countries around the world. And the disease is actually the reaction of the body to the parasite, the schistosome, that enters the human host. Now, the schistosome needs two hosts in order to complete its life cycle. So it needs a water snail, which lives in waters of a particular temperature, and it needs a human host. And it has a major impact, this disease today, on agricultural workforces and on their economic productivity. And in fact, it's been exacerbated in recent years by building dams and irrigation schemes, because these have provided new breeding sites for the snails, which are part of the process. So some years ago, Egypt set up with the United States of America a schistosomiasis research project with the aims of identifying the causes, the treatments, and possibly prevention for this disease in the villages in Egypt. And it was possible, I understand, from this project to reduce the original number of cases from around 20 million in the villages who were afflicted by the disease. So it was very successful. We were invited to provide a historical context for this modern study. So we looked at the disease in ancient Egypt. We don't know if the Egyptians actually diagnosed this particular disease. They refer in the medical papyri to the RRR disease. It's mentioned 50 times. And one of the symptoms of it is hematuria, blood in the urine. But we don't know whether the Egyptians actually identified the RRR disease as schistosomiasis. Probably not, because the causative parasite, the schistosome, was probably not visible to the naked eye, and we don't know whether they carried out autopsies, and even if they did, they were probably not performed quickly enough to discover this parasite. But we do know that the environmental conditions in ancient Egypt were the same as modern Egypt, and therefore this disease would have been prevalent. So the research project that we undertook, there are two key features here. This is the test case mummy, which we x-rayed many years before. I'll come back to that later. And here also is the schistosome, the parasite that we were able to identify in this mummy, and this is 2,000 years old. But schistosomiasis has been discovered in a number of mummies. Professor Ahmad Ruffa, in 1910, he observed calcified schistosoma in kidneys in two mummies, and this is the earliest report of the disease in mummies. And then there have been a whole series, more recently, of radiological, histological, and immunological techniques to reveal the existence of the disease in mummies. And this is just a short list of the publication of some of these. However, these techniques have their restrictions. If you think about radiology, you need access to expensive hospital equipment and a hospital willing to x-ray mummies. It's also a technique that is only applicable for full body mummies. It's no use for tissue samples. Histology is, of course, useful for looking at samples, but you have to find tissue samples that contain either the parasite or the egg. So when you're obtaining tissue samples from mummies, it's a bit like looking for cats in coal holes. You are lucky if you land up with a tissue sample with parasites or eggs in it. So in Manchester, what we did was to develop a new application, in this case of immunocytochemistry. And the researcher who did this, she developed the technique which shows up if the antigens to the disease are present. And she worked first of all on modern mouse tissue, and you can see here in the top image the antigen is present in this case. She worked on two versions of schistosomiasis, which are both present in modern and probably in ancient Egypt, Mansouri and Hematobium. And then she went on in the middle image to identify the antigens in a 50-year-old tissue from a modern Egyptian cadaver. And this was the hematobium, the bladder version again. And then she went on to look at ancient Egyptian tissue and found that it was positive. You could get immunostaining on ancient Egyptian tissue, although it was thousands of years old. And this showed that the antigens to schistosoma survives thousands of years. Now, calcification of the bladder is a classic symptom of urinary schistosomiasis. And this had been observed radiologically in a mummy that we'd looked at some years before, and I showed on a previous image. So we knew that this mummy was positive for hematobium conditions. So we went back to the mummy, we biopsied a tissue sample from the area of the bladder, and then the researcher undertook the immunocytochemistry investigation. And this revealed a 2,000-year-old male hematobium worm. And this was the first identification of parasite DNA in a mummy. And this was later confirmed with DNA tests. So lifestyle here, probably a member of the middle class of the immigrant communities in Egypt who settled in Egypt in the Hellenistic or Ptolemaic and Roman empires. Profession of this woman is unknown. She came from Hawara in the Fayum province and lived in the 1st century AD or CE. And here the probable pharmaceutical treatment was balanites oil. So just to draw to a conclusion, I'd just like to look at plants in healing and treatment contexts in two other ways. First of all, the Temple of Hathor, a dendra, where they were used as part of the therapeutic dream. And then secondly, at Deir el-Medina, another royal workers' residence town, where they played an important role in a woman's pregnancy, childbirth, and subsequent treatment. So first of all, the sanatorium at Dendra. This is the only excavated sanatorium from ancient Egypt, although certainly others existed. You can see it here in the right-hand image. It's in the precinct, in the surrounding area of the Temple of Hathor at Dendra. In the left-hand image, you can see one of the baths in which the patients were bathed, because the sanatorium was a place where the sick came to be treated for both physical and mental afflictions. And we know quite a lot about the way in which the sanatoria worked. You get examples, of course, at the same time and later in Greece. And one of the treatments in the center, in the sanatorium, was the therapeutic dream, when the patient was put into some kind of trance state, met the gods and discussed their ailments with them. The gods prescribed treatments which were given to the patient through the agency of the priests, and these, of course, included plant recipes. So they're an important element of treatment in the temple system. Now, the town or village, really, of Deir el-Medina is something that we are closely involved with ourselves in the KNH Centre. We have a joint mission to Deir Medina, working with the University of St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States of America. And we're looking at the evidence, the paleopathological evidence from the burials in the tombs that surround this town. And they're very interesting because these are not elite, these are the ordinary workmen and their families. And they're buried in graves. You can see on the right-hand side, the burial pit is in the foreground, and then you have this miniature pyramid to mark the tomb at a time when the royal family had given up using pyramids. These workmen had these mini pyramids in association with their burials. Now, the town you can see here on the left, very tightly packed and with houses in terraced rows. And the workmen lived here with their families, and then they went to work for 8-day periods across the mountaintop down into the Valley of the Kings. You can see on the right-hand side the so-called peak above the Valley of the Kings, which may have been the reason, because it looks a bit like a pyramid, why they chose this site in the first place. Now, in the town of Deir Medina, there is interesting evidence both from the surviving inscriptions and also from scenes on the walls of the houses, how they went about dealing with childbirth and the period after that, times of physical danger and difficulty for the woman and child. So they had special confinement pavilions, and in other town sites where there were gardens, these were probably built in the gardens. But at Deir Medina, because the area of the house was so limited, these were put up on the top of the flat roof. And they consisted of papyrus stalk columns, walls woven from plants, and roofing mats. Now, the room was used as a birthing chamber, and sometimes they also used the front room of the house, because here there is an inbuilt platform which was probably used, and the wall decoration shows themes that are associated with birthing, such as the gods of fertility and childbirth. Now, the evidence for this shows that throughout the lying-in period and the childbirth itself and after the birth, the mother wore no clothing except for a collar and girdle, and her hair was dressed in a particular distinctive way. During her birth period, she was attended and supported by older women who may have been relatives or even professional midwives. And afterwards, she was isolated in this birthing room for 14 days. And there she was assisted and fed by these same girls who are shown naked and with the same hairstyle. So the important thing to take away from this is that plants were seen as an integral and protective part of the woman's childbirth procedure. And they were magically imbued, as we've said, it was believed, and so would bring this both to life and to try to ensure that the mother and the child didn't die and did not suffer serious illness. So in Egypt, we have summarized a set of unique conditions. We've got a continuous history of a population in one place, in one country, for some 7,000 years, going back 2,000 years to the end of ancient history, but then 5,000 years before that. And this gives us a unique opportunity to look at epidemiological evidence and the history of treatment in both medicine and pharmacy over a very long period of time. We also have both those intentional and unintentional mummies spanning all the social classes, so you can compare the royalty with the peasants. We've also got skeletal and mummified remains. So you can use a whole lot of diagnostic techniques for the skeletal remains, but also for the tissue, such as the histological and immunological methods, as well as now the molecular techniques, such as ancient DNA. For our particular pharmacy project, ancient and modern plant samples are available for study. And we've also, as well as all this physical evidence, we've got the medical papyri, evidence about the diagnosis, the treatment, and the pharmacy that was used. So ancient Egypt provides this unique and unparalleled opportunity, really, to study the early history of medicine and the early history of these pharmaceutical treatments. And I think one of the really interesting things to take away is how much ancient Egyptian pharmacy had to offer and to give eventually to modern pharmaceutical treatments today. Thank you very much.